Welcome to the latest Off the Page podcast, and our topic today is, will the global tech sector prosper following a changing government in the United States? I'm Tim Fryer, and I'm joined in the studio by my E+T colleague Tanya Weaver. And today our special guest, Paul Dempsey, is dialing in from Washington. Paul has been a long-time contributor to E+T, being our specialist in geopolitical issues, knowledge gained from his various stints in America, China and Southeast Asia. He's also written an excellent article analysing how Donald Trump's election victory might affect the tech sector, and that feature will run in our January issue of E+T. I'll bring in Paul straight away. You're currently based in Washington and keep an eagle eye on Silicon Valley. While Donald Trump is not yet president, I imagine there are already ripples going around the tech sector in anticipation of him assuming office. What's the mood like over there?
A bit mixed. I think there's obviously a lot of concern about the overall economy and some of Trump's plans. For technology in particular, there are some focus areas. I think one of the first ones, in fact, the primary one to touch upon, seems to be tariffs. Now, this is Trump's plan to apply a blanket tariff across all imports to the US. One doesn't usually see the main lobbying groups for technology get too publicly antsy, but where they are doing so, it is about these tariffs. The US, just to pull up a number for you, electronics and electrical equipment represent the largest particular sector for imports in the US. According to the UN, in 2023, we're looking at numbers somewhere in the region of, as you looked it up, $463 billion. That's about 15% of all US imports. And one of the biggest reasons for that is obviously that the US does not have a lot of electronics manufacturing capacity. It's trying to bring back semiconductor manufacturing through the Chips and Science Act. This is a Biden administration proposal that passed back in 2022 with bipartisan support at the time, which is offering multi-billion-dollar subsidies for people to build fabs, basically. But those are only going to start coming on stream in 2026. And probably 2026 at the earliest second half of the year. The problem you then have is the chips come out of those places, but the US doesn't also have contract manufacturing in any real depth. So the problem there is you make the chips and you have to send them overseas, probably to Asia, maybe to Mexico, and then they have to come back into the US, which means they're subject to the tariffs. So from a financial point of view, Gary Shapiro, who's, if you like, technology's lead lobbyist, he's the CEO of the Consumer Technology Association, is warning that these tariffs could actually reverse all the progress that the US has made in terms of cutting back inflation, as well as reducing interest rates. I think the other thing that's a concern is obviously immigration. Trump's plan to deport billions he believes of illegals won't actually or shouldn't actually affect technology that much. But where there is a problem is that there's an expectation that specialist visas, particularly the H-1B scheme, which is why most highly skilled foreign technology workers get brought into the US, will either be frozen at its current level with a cap that already Silicon Valley thinks is insufficient, or may indeed be cut. So you have two particular concerns there. There are other issues related to this. I think there are concerns about what Trump plans to do in terms of artificial intelligence. Biden issued an executive order on artificial intelligence. Trump has said publicly he intends to cancel that completely. Trump is now very close, as we know, to Elon Musk. Elon Musk is also very uncomfortable about that and has his own positions on AI. So even though Biden had managed to get the big guys like Meta and Google and Apple on side with his AI order, that looks like it could be thrown in the bin. And then I think there's a slight worry basically about crypto, but I think that maybe is separate from being something that is immediately at the forefront of the minds of Valley CEOs at the moment. So very mixed picture, trying to read what is happening with Trump's appointments or proposed appointments as president-elect. Some of those have caused a lot of discomfort, as I'm sure you've seen over in the UK, although in terms of those technology, maybe we're still in a wait-and-see situation.
Maybe the thing that we've highlighted so many times over this podcast is the biggest challenge and the biggest danger facing humanity, of course, is climate change. You were just about to start talking about the appointments that Donald Trump had made. One of his key appointments as Energy Secretary is Chris Wright, CEO of Liberty Energy, and he is a climate change denier and fossil fuel advocate. I'll bring in Tanya here, actually. What do you think this says? There's a bit of a rhetoric question, and I know what Tanya's going to say because we talk about this in the office, but what do you think this says about the commitment to reducing carbon emissions and progressing renewable energy, Tanya?
Well, there's no commitment, is there? I mean, Trump has pledged to boost oil and gas production in the US, as in his own words, he wants to drill, baby, drill, and end Biden's pause on liquefied natural gas export terminals. I mean, with Trump famously having said that he thinks climate change is a hoax, he will no doubt bring an end to climate initiatives and rules aimed at lowering emissions. What does this mean? Rolling back electric vehicle mandates and other policies aimed at reducing automotive emissions? I mean,
the effect of Donald Trump's administration on the rest of the world. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking that we've just had COP29 and we're looking for people to buy into global reduction of carbon emissions. Last time Trump pulled out of the COP process. If he does that again, it's going to have a massive impact on global emissions from a first-hand point of view. I think the US is responsible for about 11% of carbon emissions. But also for the countries that we're trying to persuade into the process, it effectively lets them off the hook, doesn't it? Do you think that this, from a climate change perspective, is a bit of a disaster?
It'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, there are two things going on here. There's obviously the US as one of the lead first world economies, and as you say, sort of providing some kind of incentive. And obviously that's one of the things they're discussing at the COP is financing for countries that are most affected by climate change. That's to reduce their emissions and to combat the problem. I think, yes, if Trump pulls back again, if we have a repeat of what happened with the Paris Accords, that's not going to be good. It's going to be very, very bad from a global perspective. You're already seeing countries like Argentina wonder whether or not they're going to pull back from Paris, because if the Americans aren't going to go into it, why the hell should we do it? And then you have the commitments that are going to come from other big players. So I think that's a worry. The strange thing is that at the same time, the US actually is responding quite well to what Paris requires. And I think this is something that we're going to maybe see when we continue the conversation. This is because they're working around Trump. Or what's happening is at least 20 states, and these are some of the biggest industrial states, and some of them red, some of them blue states, have passed local legislation saying that they want to be at 100% renewables between 2040 and 2050. So that's actually bringing down the US's emissions, even though Trump is saying he's a climate change denier. What's happened is, if you like, it's another one of these issues that's controversial that they've decided, well, the states are going to deal with that. So the extent to which that kind of local action, though, is going to encourage others to follow on with the Paris plan, I would say is fairly limited. But in terms of what's happening here, what you're seeing is the clean energy lobby, if you like, if it can't work through Trump, it's working around him. And it's something that it learned how to do during his first term in office.
Over here, of course, we forget that the United States is effectively a whole load of different countries all pulled together, isn't it? They're each one countryside in their own right and quite separately legislation-wise. But are we just going to see that you say there's 20 or so states going their own path towards a greener future, but they're probably not going to be the ones that have got a whole load of oil shale in their back gardens. They don't have access to the fossil fuels.
Probably not. I mean, some of them are some of the larger industrial states where there is a combination of both a lot of, if you like, traditional industrial activity as well as energy. The thing is, I mean, Trump says drill, baby, drill. The US is already drilling, baby, drilling. Under Biden, actually, it has mined more fossil fuels than at any point in its history. But at the same time, alongside that, there have been, from the federal level, the clean energy proposals for things like electric vehicles and infrastructure that are in the Inflation Reduction Act, another piece of legislation that may well be ditched by Trump. But it's not as clear a picture as you might think. I think the other thing is that issue of severe weather over here in the US, if you look at places that have been hit by some of the most recent events, have tended to be red states. They've tended to be towards the south. And there is an increasing feeling among people in those states that something needs to be done. And that may not translate itself into anything happening at the presidential level for 4 years. Obviously, there are the midterms in 2 years' time. But what it can do is translate itself into state action. So I think it's almost like we have to wait and see. As I said, looking for umbrella American leadership here, I think under Trump, that's not going to happen. But if we're worried about the more climate change and actually dealing with climate change, we may not see as much as we'd like, but we may see a lot more than we expect.
Okay, that makes me feel a bit better.
But the message it gives out, as we were saying, it may be that those individual states are acting unilaterally, but the message it gives out to the world in general is not a particularly positive one, is it?
No, it isn't. As I said, I mean, the US is expected to be a leader in these matters. I think the big concern is, as the US backs out, how much leverage does it actually give China? And how much leverage does it give other fast developing countries? Because the real issue that we've got is getting them to tamp down their rate of emissions. Now, the Chinese actually have done quite a lot on clean energy, but they're still adding quite a lot of coal power in terms of power stations. But they are now, in terms of emissions, they're way ahead of the US and they're way ahead of Europe.
Yeah, they're going great guns with solar. So much solar has been installed.
They're basically pushing forward on absolutely everything. Less coal maybe than was the original plan. But it's to the extent to which China in particular, but also any of the other developing nations in that region in Southeast Asia, can turn around and say, well, if the Americans aren't doing anything, that's unfair. I mean, this has long been the argument is, well, you've had the chance to industrialize your economy. We haven't. We haven't had those benefits. So I'm terribly sorry. We're going to keep building coal power stations. We're going to build what we need. It will create, I think, a lot of geopolitical tension that opens up a window for China in particular to exploit within the developing world, because it's the developing world that's being hit first by a lot of what's happening with climate change. And China can then go in there, as it has done, for example, across much of Africa, with a very, very large checkbook, and thereby expand its international influence, its global influence. So I think that's the other problem that you have if America steps back from Paris, as Trump is expected to do. But he's a nationalist, he's a nativist. I mean, this is, America first, and to some extent, America alone. So whether or not it's just going to be a case of having to deal with that, does Europe have to step up and do more? Does the UK have to step up and do more? Well, we'll see.
I mean, we're tiny in comparison.
Indeed. You actually identified the biggest issue as tariffs, and a subset of that is the CHIPS Act, as far as the electronics sector is concerned. Trump's actually said that it was going to cancel the CHIPS Act on the grounds it was only supporting massive, well-established companies who are arguably not the ones who need support anyway. And I think his argument was that if the tariffs are big enough, then those companies are not going to want to export to the US, and they're going to want to set up their facilities here anyway, irrespective of the fact, as you mentioned, that there is no contract manufacturing sector virtually left in the US. So those chips then still need to be exported to the Far East for the final assembly. But does it actually make some sense in what Trump is saying? Is that why is he supporting the huge wafer fab companies when if the market is there in the US, then they will come with their own money? Why are they spending billions and billions of US taxpayers' money to support them?
Well, I mean, the question starts to become, is the market there in the US?
Well, it's still the biggest consumer market, isn't it?
It is, but let's look at the CTA crunched its numbers. Obviously, it's coming at it from a particular point of view, but it estimated that the tariffs could lead to rises in consumer goods or consumer electronics of up to 46% for a laptop. Slightly less for a phone, 20%. So then what are you looking at? You're looking at a much slower refresh cycle, if we consider these things to be absolute needs. Yeah, and they are in our increasingly digital society. you're looking at a much, much slower refresh cycle, certainly within the US. That is going to hurt. That, as you say, it's the biggest market. If you put the dampeners on the biggest market with those kind of inflationary numbers, it's going to hurt everybody within the supply chain. There's no question about it. So then, the question is the US the most attractive market anyway? If the prices are such, you can't get the business. What about Europe? What about Asia? Tariffs have never worked. There's always been this concept that if you apply tariffs, you somehow repatriate a lot of activity locally and you stimulate your own economy. And it's been tried time and time again. Every time they have proved to be inflationary. Now, tariffs can have a role, if you like, national security, geopolitics, that kind of thing, when you're talking about the rivalry between China and the US, and also the feeling on the US's side, with some justification, that China hasn't always stuck to the rules of the WTO in terms of the imports of goods that go into the US and why there is a trade imbalance. So they're being used not as a revenue tool, but more as a political tool. As a revenue tool, though, they have always failed. They always have the same impact. You can't find, or it's very, very difficult to find economists over here who think tariffs are a good idea in any respect, for any industry, never mind ours.
Do they need to be given a bit of time, though? As you mentioned, if it's just for wafer fabs, then it's going to take 2-3 at least years before we actually have any silicon coming off the fabrication plants. And even then, there is no EMS sector, electronic manufacturing services sector. If they stuck to the tariffs, they held their nerve, as it were, wouldn't the EMS companies re-emerge in the States as well? And the whole supply chain along with it, obviously.
That's Trump's position. Very few people in the industry buy it. It'd take too long. The bottom line is that to build the infrastructure that we have today as a result of globalization in terms of the electronic supply chain would take you a decade. Now, those tariffs with the potentially punitive effects in terms of inflation and interest rates on an economy for an entire decade would be incredibly destructive. The Chips and Science Act, which got bipartisan support originally, remember this was backed by Republicans and Democrats, looked at that as a position and said, no, what we've got to do is we've got to incentivize the construction of semiconductor manufacturing domestically. That's what we have to do. And there was broad agreement on that. Economists agreed on that. The majority of economists agreed on that because it's just going to take too long if you go down that tariff route. The amount of damage that gets done in the meantime is going to be horrific.
Looking at it from the other side, if you're in terms of holding your nerve, should they be holding the nerve with the Chips and Science Act anyway? Because, and I'm drawing a parallel here, as I often do in the UK with HS2, which was proposed a dozen years ago. It was rubber stamped 4 or 5 years ago. And then it was whittled away in 2021 and again last year into something that was smaller. That lack of central support pulled the rug from underneath a whole industry and the supply chain that was supporting it, particularly for anybody who was investing in the idea of levelling up, for example. But is the same true in the US electronics industry? If they remove the Chips Act support to these big wafer companies who have put billions of their own money into it and the supply chain around it, is it devastating for the electronics industry if it switches from Chips Act subsidies to a tariff-based process?
I think so. I think that there are two things as well to consider here, which is what the motivations for the Chips and Science Act were. The first was this idea that you have to rebuild some kind of high technology manufacturing sector in the United States, that globalization was imbalanced, geopolitical concerns about the fact of being very dependent upon Taiwan and Chinese saber rattling and all these issues. So there was a national security component to Chips and Science. I think that's one thing that you've got to look at from that point of view. So losing that obviously brings back all of those concerns about the supply chain. If you take all that away, again, dependent upon Taiwan, and to some extent depended upon the whims of Xi Jinping. Just in a general point, though, if you pull the rug out from underneath capital projects of this size, you're not just going to see skepticism applying to semiconductors and that supply chain. You're going to see it apply across the board in all terms of inward investment, in all terms of capital, major capital investment in manufacturing, which, is going to be disastrous. Because the other problem is, and this was pointed out to me, we've got to look at this the other way around. I build a factory in the States because of the tariffs, okay? Now, I have a certain amount of capacity. I'm going to probably need to export from that factory as well. And guess what? Everybody that the US puts a tariff on is going to put a tariff back on the US. So that also mitigates the advantage of bringing it back, which is the fact that, okay, I've just swapped the people that I'm paying the taxes to, or I've swapped the people that I'm passing on the cost of these tariffs to the consumer. It gives you a bad reputation. And at the same time, there just isn't a financial logic to it. And we're talking, even if you talk about contract manufacturing today, we talk about billions of dollars for fabs. Well, it's billions of dollars just to put together an iPhone assembly plant. These are very, very big investments. They have to be done at scale. If they are done at scale, that almost certainly means you are thinking of having some kind of output that is exported from that site. So the phrase that you keep hearing is economically illiterate.
Surely it's to everybody's advantage if the US economy is strong. We don't want there to be sneezes in the UK that could affect the rest of the world, if you like. Are there opportunities in Europe, the UK, if there are problems thrown up by this tariff-induced malaise in the US?
The impact would be global. I don't think anyone's kidding themselves about that. The size of the US market is always, there is nobody who goes into our business really without having to put the US market pretty high up in the business plan. Maybe there are some Chinese companies that have a sufficient domestic market now that they can think primarily about home. So Huawei, has managed to survive and continue to be very profitable without really having access to the US market anymore. But, look at its domestic market. It hits everybody. It's a trade war. This is what everybody goes on. Let's not call it tariffs. Let's call it what it is. It's a trade war. And in a trade war, there are going to be casualties on every side.
And not necessarily any winners either.
And not necessarily any winners. No. Well, I don't know. Unless you sort of subscribe to these rather crazy notions of disaster capitalism and things like that. Well, not crazy. I mean, they are, solid concepts. I mean, those are the people who win. How do you hedge it?
Let's leave that subject there. Rather than talk about the capital markets, and we've all got our own opinions of them. Anyway, let's move on to artificial intelligence as a subject. Now, one of the things that Trump is very big on, and you said in our previous correspondence, Paul, that this was one of the reasons why Silicon Valley was actually not necessarily as anti the new administration as people might originally think. He's not a fan of regulation, red tape, is he, Donald Trump? With artificial intelligence, and Biden introduced an executive order around it, Trump said he would remove it straight away. We're not 100% sure if that is really the case. He might withdraw the executive order, but might come in with something else instead.
Trump has already committed to rolling back Biden's executive order on AI regulation. This means that tech companies looking to scale AI, like Microsoft and Amazon Web Services, will probably face less regulatory oversight under a Trump administration. This will give them more freedom in deploying AI technologies. And, what does that mean?
I think there's still a matter of trying to sort out what the playing field's going to look like. If you look at the people who are close to Trump, they have differing opinions as to how AI should be regulated. At one end, you've got J.D. Vance as vice president. He wants no regulation whatsoever. He wants it completely left open. But then, for example, you have Elon Musk, and Elon Musk has made it clear that he believes regulation is necessary in some form. He doesn't like Biden's order, but in some form to provide guardrails because of existential risk. So you have these two voices feeding into Trump if he's going to abandon everything that Biden has done. And he probably will, because he thinks it's part of the woke agenda, because it has all sorts of things about, fairness, preventing prejudicial material and that kind of thing. So he probably will rip it up. But what they're going to get instead, who knows? The Republicans themselves have an interesting position on it. If you like, not quite so dogmatic as a Vance or a Trump. It's a question of, do we regulate this now or is it too early? Because it's still vacancy, technology whose shape is developing. Therefore, if you regulate too early, you don't account for what's coming next. And we do seem to have reached or be reaching a plateau with LLMs. So there is some justification in that. I think the other part of it is light touch regulation, because there is competition with China. This is the thing that keeps coming up every time regulation is meant. This was the famous thing that came up when they said, let's take a pause in terms of all of the AI R&D. There was a famous letter that was signed, Musk being one of the signatories. And everyone turned around and said, well, Beijing's not going to do that. The Great Hall of the People is not going to stop. And we've got to realize that from a national security point of view, this is important. So I would expect quite a lot of the Biden outline to survive, but with a much lighter touch, I think. It's kind of what the Valley wants, although it was more comfortable with Biden than I think most people appreciate. But it wants to be left alone. It always wants to be left alone. It doesn't like regulation generally. It loves this idea, talking about Musk, it loves this idea of Doge. The Department of Government Efficiency, how one is to take anything seriously from someone that's named after a cryptocurrency is for you to debate for yourselves. But this idea of going around trying to cut out lots of red tape at the federal level, that's very much appreciated generally. So, if you're in that kind of environment, AI is not going to, I don't think is going to get heavily regulated unless something fairly catastrophic happens.
I'm inclined to think that Trump's electioneering style is to say that he's going to do all of something, or he's going to do nothing of something else, or he's going to ban this, or whatever it is. It's all extremes, isn't it? It's very much black and white argument as to everything. So when he says he's going to get rid of the executive order around AI, I'm inclined to think that he can't do that immediately, because to completely deregulate AI and let it go its own way is deregulating data as well. And although you mentioned the competition with China in terms of AI development, if the data is part of the AI, then he's not going to want that to get out to China and Russia or anywhere else as well.
The first thing to remember is it's an executive order. So this isn't really formal regulation. So the situation's already very fluid. It's already open. Executive orders can apply certain objectives, but in terms of cold, hard regulation, that's still something that would have to go through Congress, and nothing has gone through Congress yet. The US is far behind the EU and arguably even China in terms of its regulatory position on AI. It's just that Biden set down, it's almost like the Pirates of the Caribbean. They're not so much rules as guidelines. Actually, no, Trump could do that fairly easily. It doesn't actually rip that much out of the system. It just means he's going to go in a different direction. Will he keep parts of the EO? Probably. But which parts, we don't know. One of the problems we've got is you have this thing in American politics of these sort of 2 months after the election. We're used to sort of like the helicopter following the new prime minister down to Downing Street while the other one gets his stuff out. And the following day, everything flips. That's not what happens over here. You have this 2-month period, or slightly over 2 months, when everyone's trying to second guess what the administration is going to do when it gets executive power. Now, that's not until January 20. So we're in this state now where everyone's expecting things in a broad sense in areas where they want specifics. And I think with AI, I think the feeling is that now we've gone so far down the line, something more specific has to happen in terms of what you're telling the industry at a government level. None of it really starts to become clear until that executive power and the executive orders actually start coming out. In many respects, everything with Trump comes down to your guess is as good as mine.
That's one thing that is predictable about Trump, is that he is an unpredictable person and prone to rash decision-making. I mean, even if we just take the EV thing, electric vehicles, he said that he was against it. He was going to end the electric vehicle mandate day one. And then, despite this negative rhetoric, he's now said he's for electric vehicles. And then he said, I have to be because Elon endorsed me very strongly.
This is a very interesting point, isn't it? And you mentioned it with the cryptocurrency nods with Doge, of course, Department of Government Efficiency. And that's what Elon's job is actually going to be, isn't it? He's heading up that. So this role of Elon Musk in government, he's got so much self-interest there, hasn't he? Obviously, SpaceX is completely tied in with NASA. And these are global issues. They're not just American issues. Obviously, X is global social media phenomenon or whatever else you want to call it. Tesla, as Tanya was saying, with the electric vehicles. Having Donald Trump as a best friend all of a sudden is very useful from a business perspective, isn't it?
I suppose sort of Elon appointing himself as the first nerd it's an interesting situation. I'm wondering, everybody here, you talk about people sort of wondering what's really going to happen in January. Everybody is wondering whether or not two mercurial figures like Trump and Musk will still be talking to one another by January. Both of them are well known for having pretty explosive fallouts with people from absolutely nowhere. Personally, I believe this is one of those relationships where there's so much benefit on both sides. I think actually expect to see Musk have, at the very least, Trump's ear for quite some time to come. As you say, so much of Musk's business is dependent upon either US government policy on EVs. Remember, he's also in clean energy. He's got so many contracts with NASA. So if you're Elon Musk, whatever your personality is, you're not going to wind up your main customer. That is going to persist. Now, just how much influence it turns out that Musk has at the end of the day. Now, that's a more interesting one to consider. He's taken this, so we have Doge, and he's put Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy into this Department of Government Efficiency, except it isn't a department in the traditional sense, right? They have no cabinet rank. It has no executive authority. That would require an act of Congress. So all it can do is make recommendations. Now, I don't know how many people listening to this remember Yes Minister, but there's a touch of the Humphrey Appleby's about this.
Paul, I was thinking more of the Spanish Inquisition, actually.
It's classic Whitehall stuff. It's like, well, we've got this very, very thorny problem. How did we deal with it? Oh, and he's got a big mouth as well. We want to keep him shut up. We'll give him a committee. Give him a special committee, park him off over there and get him to produce a huge report. Yeah. And also, the fact that this is Musk. Remember, the other rule of politics is the more you talk about something, the less likely you are to do anything about it. So again, we're waiting and we're seeing. Is this a very clever political move? Probably not so much on Trump's part, but Susan Wiles's part. She's his chief of staff and very, very smart lady, to basically sideline Trump and Ramaswamy, make them think that they have Trump's ear while things carry on in another direction? Or is it a genuine attempt to cut all of that red tape? Because the way that they are talking about it is crazy. Ramaswamy has talked about, quote, deleting particular government departments en masse. And one of the targets they've had is the Department of Education. Delete. To a Brit, that's Doctor Who, that's Cybermen, and that's Vivek as a Cyberman without the fetish gear. You hear this stuff. You see the way that Musk marched into Twitter, threw out all of these staff, carrying his seat, let that sink in. And the following day, they're desperately calling up some of them because their senior technical staff and the system won't bloody work without them. But they've just been cut. Now, to go about something as complex as the American federal government, is there a more complex beast in the world? Someone once said to me, the only thing in terms of complexity as an organization that comes close is the UK National Health Service. And actually, it's a huge distance between the two. If you're going to go in and try to reform it on that basis, it ain't going to work. And what's more, this is where people think, well, yeah, they can write their piece of paper, cut education, cut health, and, I'm just picking out various ones. You give them 18 months to assemble recommendations. At the end of that 18 months, you're in the electoral cycle for the midterms. You hold your hands up and say, oh, no, we can't do anything radical before the midterms. Oh, no, because, we've got the House and the Senate at stake. And then effectively, it's kind of like, does anyone remember where that report got put? Oh, it's gone somewhere. The other thing is you have this thing called Project 2025, 900 pages of pretty detailed. I've only really been able to skim it, trying to find bits that were particularly relevant to us, but it has a lot of detail in there about governmental and departmental reform and policy reform. And the people who are actually running the show, that's the guys in the cabinet and one level below it, people like Stephen Miller, notorious because of his positions on immigration, but more generally, someone who is, I would say, a key Trump policy wonk. That's the way things are going to go.
Do you think that Donald Trump's presidency, on the whole, is going to be good for the tech industries, not just in America, but around the world?
If they go through with the tariffs, I think anything else that they do is going to be destructive. It's going to be negative, both for the US and for the rest of the world. If some sense can be talked into them about exactly how they apply these tariffs, then I think, funnily enough, a lot of Valley CEOs are going to be quite comfortable with this. They're going to see the reductions in regulation. They're going to see a fairly relaxed approach to AI. They're going to see a fairly relaxed approach as well to M&A, remember. If I'm sitting there in a CEO seat, I would say, I can live with this. I can pretty much live with it as long as I'm not getting these tariffs.
Tanya, how about you?
I think the biggest issue for me always is the climate. And that just really worries me, that we're not going to have all these initiatives to decarbonise. And I don't think that's going to happen under Trump.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that could...
I agree with that as well.
It's probably the biggest issue, I would say, and all the other issues. I always think, and it works on a political level across governments, but it certainly works in sector as innovative as the one that we all work in. And that's that companies will get on with it. If they don't like the way that things are going, they'll find ways of working with people, and we'll still all be here in 4 years' time, and hopefully there won't be any licking of any wounds or anything like that, and hopefully we'll all have prospered.
Just one thing I'd add to that. The guy who's just been appointed for Secretary of Energy.
Chris Wright,
yeah. I think what's interesting about Chris Wright is, yes, he may be a climate denier in public. He sits on the board of a company developing small modular reactors, which are seen as one of the various ways in which we can decarbonize the economy.
It also just makes you wonder, was this all rhetoric for the campaign?
They do like to... Everything is either right or wrong, isn't it? The shades of grey are not necessarily there. Anyway, we'll call it a day for that. That's been really interesting. Paul, thank you ever so much, and you as well as always, Tanya. That's been really interesting. This podcast is available with all the rest of our podcasts in this series on our YouTube channel and webpage. And in the meantime, all I can say is thank you very much for listening in today. Thank you.